Great. And many of you guys have heard the 27 and 28 measures spiel already a lot of times. So thanks for kind of bearing with us. As Laura mentioned, we thought that today's presentation is going to just kind of be strictly kind of an overview, sort of a higher level presentation about the measures, how they came to be, where we are, and next steps. And then I think in one of the next calls that she has, she's going to kind of bring in more of the technical piece of it and how do you pull all the information together from a kind of a GIS database aspect and so forth. So kind of keep that in mind as I'm going through the presentation and discussion today. And because it's a small group, it's a good opportunity, I think, also for folks to ask questions as we go along. So don't feel like you need to wait until the end. Feel free to kind of jump in and ask me to clarify something or kind of repeat something if it would help. So to begin, I think kind of rewind the clock about almost 3.5 to 4 years. So back in 2012, the 303D and TMDL program started to hit a point where there was an opportunity, if you will, for the program to kind of rethink how the program was going to move forward into the future. And so many of you know that kind of beginning in 2012, there were almost a couple of year-long discussions that occurred with the regions and with the states about how to help refocus the 303D and TMDL program in light of a lot of the consent decrees and settlement agreements that had been driving the program since probably the early 2000s, when EPA was sued for not developing TMDLs, if you will. And so for about 10 years, I think states and regions were really cranking through and churning out thousands and thousands of TMDLs. And then all of a sudden, those consent decrees started to come to an end, and I think states as well as regions really felt, the time was ripe where we needed to start focusing on kind of implementation and potentially going back and revising some of those older TMDLs. And so it really set the stage for the program to have an opportunity to start engaging with states and regions about how to kind of refocus the program going forward. And so hence came out of that what we call our 303D program vision. I'm not going to kind of read through it. You guys can read this, and I can also share with everybody the presentation afterwards. But a part of the vision itself, it had 6 goals. There was a prioritization goal, an assessment goal, a protection goal, an alternatives goal, an engagement goal, and an integration goal. For purposes of today, I think the main goal that we'll touch on the most is going to be the prioritization, because that's the piece that directly links to the measures that we'll be talking about. So some kind of important things to keep in mind as we think about this 303D program vision is that it's not a regulatory change, so it's not changing any of the obligations that we have under our statute or our regulations. It's an opportunity to actually provide some flexibility to states as they continue to implement the program, and also an opportunity to integrate across programs, kind of moving away from some of the stovepipeness that we also run into at EPA, allowing for, again, kind of that cross-program coordination and collaboration. Also, it starts focusing on moving away from what many of you that have been in the program for a long time have heard, is what we always refer to as a bean count. So for once the consent decrees and settlement decrees hit in 2005, EPA had developed a strategic measure, and that was counting just the number of TMDLs. So it was kind of a little a check, if you will, and it sort of really became known as the bean count measure because basically it sort of made all TMDLs equal, but that wasn't the case, as many of you guys know from working with the states in your regions, that states monitor their waters and differently. They have different standards. They define their assessment units very differently. So by moving towards a new vision, it also gave us a new an opportunity to look at how can we better measure the success of the program. So it allowed us to start moving away from numbers and to looking at an area to better communicate the work that's being done. And then it also is giving us, I think, an opportunity to also look at kind of looking beyond and how can we better link to, I think, the suite of measures so that, again, the measures aren't stovepipe, but that they also kind of build on one another, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So as I mentioned, the one goal that is the main really emphasis of the presentation today is really the prioritization, because that's really what at least the WQ27 measure is really based on. So one of the key aspects of the 303D program vision is that it was an opportunity to let states take a step back and really look at where are the areas within their state that they would like to be focusing their resources in developing plans from 2016 to 2022. And the idea is that states wouldn't have to change those long-term priorities if they didn't choose to, because we also had a complementary measure that would allow for us to recognize where there were plans that were being developed that weren't part of the original suite of priorities. I think we learned a lot actually since the early conversations of the measure, and we're actually are building in a lot of flexibility in the measure. So while we're encouraging states to set long-term priorities, and I think the states are actually coming to the table and doing their best to do that, we are acknowledging, though, that there are things that are out of our control right now that may be out of our control in the future that may require a state to change their priorities, and we're building that into the measure. So, but it is really exciting to see a lot of states kind of taking a step back and actually engaging more with the non-point source programs or their monitoring programs if they're not all housed together. It's taken a while, though, I'll have to say, but it's really a lot of momentum, I think, that's been started, and you guys actually see it quite more than we do. It's also allowing states to look at and focus on not only TMDLs, but look at where there might be other plans that might be more beneficial in the near term that might get us to water quality standards faster, that may lead to a TMDL not being done. So we're also exploring a lot more the alternatives that states may do, as well as looking at how can we also start recognizing the work that states are doing in protecting their waters. The interesting thing about protection is that it's new to the 303D program, because we always really focused heavily on the impaired water side of the house, but it's also has given us an opportunity to kind of reach outside of our program areas and really interact a lot more closely with the non-point source program. Many of you guys know, if you Linda Hall at our headquarters office is the branch chief for that program area, and they're really working on identifying and helping us explain and talk about what protection really means. So that's those are the three types of plans, though, for purposes of our measure that we focus on. And also, as I mentioned, the prioritization is really giving the states the flexibility to identify and set priorities in a way that makes sense for them. And as we're seeing, not one size fits all. So on the next slide, again, why a new measure, why now? And as I mentioned, the consent decree and settlement agreements are coming to an end. We just have a handful of them out there. The litigation that we're actually seeing nowadays is very targeted. So we're not seeing these broad-scale state kind of consent decree settlement agreements, but very targeted TMDL-specific litigation. So the litigation atmosphere is definitely changing. We still have a lot of it, but it's on this aspect, it's dying down, and we only have a couple left that are out there. I think we have Alaska out there, and then I think there's maybe one or two other states where we'll be finishing that up. To date, we've developed more than 70,000 TMDLs, and then as we mentioned, it's an opportunity to identify and just better show the success in the work that the program is doing. In addition, in thinking about the new approach and the new measures, it's also trying to, again, set the stage for a suite of measures that build upon one another. So, and that there's a feedback loop. So that you can, you can monitor and assess your waters, and from that you can identify those that are good, those that are impaired. Where those are impaired, identifying what the right tool in the toolbox is. And then there's the mechanism of the non-point source program and NIPD's program, where we hope that actions get implemented on the ground, whether it be via BMPs or permits. And then the hope is that you go back on and monitor and assess, and as a result of the implementation of those actions, that we're starting to see waters recover. And so, as I mentioned, our measure that we'll spend most time today is focusing on that planning aspect. But we're hoping that by the way that we're changing the way the measure is communicated, that it sets itself up to improve the next suite of measures, which are on the chopping block right now, which is the SP10 and 11. How can we improve those? And then I also know that the non-point source program is doing a lot to identify how can their measures be improved as well. And then we also have our survey measures. So I think we have a state scale survey measure where we want to be able to report and show the great work that states are doing at the state level on the state scale surveys. And then we also have our national aquatic resource surveys measures. So we have a whole suite of measures, and I think by starting with the 303D and TMDL program measures with change, I think it's lending itself to make some pretty significant changes to other measures to hopefully be able to better tell the public what we're doing, being transparent, and then hopefully by using the data systems to help kind of calculate those measures, that we're hopefully going to be reducing some burden out there, not only kind of at headquarters, but at the region as well as the state level. So with anything, it takes time, and so kind of thinking we're at 2016, and 2016 was actually the first year that we successfully started to report on the WQ27 measure, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes. But the discussions for actually developing this measure started back in 2012. So we had a large work group that included states, aqua regions, folks from the headquarters, multiple branches. Again, we were focusing on replacing the bean count measure, and then we had multiple meetings. And at one point in time, I do recall that we had about 30 metrics on the table for folks to vet through and to kind of figure out what the best path forward was for communicating the success of the program as well as the vision. So at the same time as all of these discussions were going on, we had the great fortune that Dwayne actually had come back to the program after being on a detail, and had started working with all of us about a way to streamline the processing of state 303D and 305B information, specifically the geospatial piece, that would help us identify ways to, one, streamline the process, reduce cost on both ends, and be able to churn back the information out to everybody in a much more fast and efficient way. And so, so at the same time, we were also talking about the new vision, developing new measures. We were also undergoing a pretty significant effort to investigate how the use of catchments could help us improve and communicate the work that we were doing. And so many of you guys are already familiar and heard this term a lot, but the catchment-based indexing approach is how we're calculating and communicating this new measure. And so basically what you can see from this slide here, you have the HUC, the 12-digit HUC, which is outlined in the purple, and then you have the blue, which is indicating the stream, and then I guess it's sort of like a brown reddish color, the areas that are surrounded, that are outlined in black surrounding the stream, are those catchments that are draining immediately into that stream segment. And so that's really important because it's that area that's draining immediately into whether it be a lake or whether it be a stream. That's the area that we're calculating for purposes of the measures. And the nice thing about the catchment approach as well, I'll kind of just move on to my next slide, is that it allows for states to continue to index the waters in a way that makes sense for them, whether they use the National Hydrography Set 1 to 24,000 scale or 1 to 100 scale. We can consume and be able to associate the catchments with that line work. It doesn't matter, and it's also it's fast and it's quick and it's pretty efficient. It definitely took quite a bit of outreach, I think, to communicate folks about what catchments are, but I'd have to say that I think we've come a long way, and I feel pretty confident in saying that I think folks are pretty comfortable with us using catchments to communicate the measures. And one thing that I didn't mention, it's sort of that catchment gives us a common unit that allows us to be able to automate the measure and to be able to report it for all of the states and territories, except Alaska, because we're still working on seeing if we can get some resources to actually be able to develop catchment areas for them. But other than that, we're able to use catchments for purposes of communicating and reporting on this measure for everybody else. So the first measure that I'll kind of briefly touch on is WQ27. So here, I also, sometimes you might hear it referred to as a budget measure. And so when you say budget measure, it's just really the main thing to keep in mind is that it's required. It's part of our strategic plan. And so every fiscal year when headquarters is going through the various budget drills and presidential kind of gathering of information and getting ready for our kind of budget submissions, we always have to be able to provide them information on WQ27. The TMDL measures have always been a high-level measure. There's always a lot of interest in our program and how we're doing. I guess sometimes that can be good and sometimes that can be bad. Even though it is a budget measure, I will say that for many of you that are kind of familiar with the 303D program, it doesn't directly correlate to us getting extra resources, if you will, for implementing the program, because I'd have to say that our budgets have actually gone down pretty significantly. So with that being said, though, so WQ27 is a budget measure. It's a required measure, so all states have to report on it. We first started officially reporting on this measure this fiscal year, actually. And the key component of this measure to keep in mind is that this measure is focusing on states' priorities. So you might recall at the beginning of the presentation, I had mentioned that really one of the key aspects of this new vision is allowing states to kind of set their long-term priorities, meaning, where are the areas that they would like to be focusing their kind of resources and attention from 2016 to 2022. And so the idea is that states, kind of collectively look at kind of where their impaired waters are, where their good waters are, and where are the places that they would like to be kind of tracking and reporting and showing that they're going to be developing either TMDLs or alternatives, or for good waters protection approaches. So I have to say that the way that, because we kicked off this measure this past fall, we had, I think, all but 2 states that actually were able to provide us priorities, and we're working with those states right now. So I'd have to say by the end of this fiscal year, we'll have all states reporting on this measure. And I'd say most states looked at their 303D list and then identified the water body cause of impairment combinations that they really wanted to focus on. And so this graphic here just gives you a snapshot of what we have built, which is a scenario builder tool, which Laura is going to go in in more detail in a presentation in, I think, early next week. But it's our way to take the state's priorities and then kind of spit it back out for the state and then actually the region to take a look at the information. Because we are using catchments, we want to try to take the pressure off and be able to do all of those calculations again for the end user. And so the tool that we built allows us to do that. And so we're able to process the data using what the states have provided to us and is available in our Attains data system, and then compute for them using the associated catchments, the area that their priorities make up. If any of those priorities have already plans in place, then we identify and show them that information. And then one thing that it's, I think, important to also mention here is that it's kind of come up this past week with a couple of folks that I've been talking to, and that even though our measure is cycle independent, that one thing that is kind of important to keep in mind, though, is that the measure itself can be cycle independent. However, in order for us to automate a measure using the Attains data system, we need to make sure that the waters that the states want to track are part of some IR submission. Because everything really starts, in my mind, I think, with the integrated report. So even though from a measures calculation perspective, I think we can look at it from being cycle independent, but we need to still make sure and work with folks to make sure that the data that we have in Attains includes all of the waters that they either want to develop kind of a protection, a TMDL or an alternative for, or a protection approach. So that's something I think for you guys to kind of keep in mind if we come back with some odd questions about needing to get draft data from a state, if you will, because all of the assessment units that they want to prioritize may not be in the last approved IR, and they're working on the next IR, but it's not done yet. We just may need to work closely with you to fill that gap, so that way we have the assessment unit and information in the data system in order for us to automate the measure. Because without the data in the system, we can't automate the measure. And that's one area that I'm also sort of being a little bit more of a stickler on, and making sure that all of the plans are in the system as well. Because I really want to make sure that as we move forward, we've got some, kind of integrity behind the data, and that we're making sure that all the plans are there and linking to the right waters and so forth, and so we can track and really use the data system to be able to do that. So visually, when we're talking about catchments and what does that look like, we also provide tools, thanks to Laura and Wendy and others that have really helped kind of put some really detailed information together, so a state can take the information, the output, and go into ArcGIS and pull all of the pieces together as we work through the Attains redesign. And so this graphic basically just is zooming in on a HUF12 just to orient one's eyes, and then basically where you see the streams, those are areas that the state's identified, and then where there's the green outline around the stream, that tells us that the way that the state set their priorities, all of the plans are in place, so there's nothing more that needs to be done. And where there's yellow around the streams, that just tells us that there's additional plans that still need to be addressed, but they're not there yet. Not to be confusing, but I think something important to think about, or to kind of keep in mind, is that for FY16, our measure is being counted based on the green. So right now, for this fiscal year, this measure is only recognizing a state's priorities if they have all the plans in place. However, in 17, we're going to be modifying that measure to be able to show and recognize where something has been done, but not everything yet. So this next slide is moving to the kind of what we call complementary indicator measure. So this is also referred to as WQ28. Even though it is not a required measure, managers are actually strongly encouraging us to work with states and regions to report on this measure. And I think one of the main reasons why is that it actually provides a kind of a snapshot of kind of what's going on in the entire state with regard to impaired water. So this measure is different than WQ27 in the case that it's looking at the entire kind of suite of impaired waters in a state and protection waters if they tell us. So WQ27 are just the priorities that the state set. WQ28 is looking at all of the impaired waters, so whether they're on the 303D list, whether they have a TMDL, or whether they have a TMDL alternative, meaning category 4B. And then also if a state has separately identified and flagged for us that they want to track protection under this measure as well. I think a lot of managers, and sort of even sometimes myself, think it just gives you a better snapshot and picture of what's going on kind of in its entirety. And the nice thing is, because this is all being driven by the data system, W28 in reality would be able to allow you to kind of tell the broad picture of what's going on throughout the entire state. So, what's the area that's associated with, again, all of their impaired waters. In theory, you could also then say, okay, well, what's my subset of priorities, because it's all being driven by the data in the system, and then being able to, tell you kind of additional information about where all the plans are in place, where there's been some progress, and when there's been no progress at all. So very similar to the other measure in the case of using catchments. It's one thing I didn't mention. It's a weighted measure. So in addition to showing where the plans are completely in place, we're also allowing to show where states have actually maybe started to work on a plan, but they're not there yet. As many of you know, that some of these TMDLs at least can take years to track, to develop, and so we're also going to be having the allow for states to tell us where they're working on a plan, but it's not completed yet, and we'll be able to provide kind of partial recognition, if you will. So that's one aspect of this measure. So moving on, because when I talk about our 303D measures, I can't lose sight of the next suite of measures. So, so as I mentioned, as we're revamping all of the measures, as we're looking at our measures, we're trying to look at all of the measures to see how they can build on one another. And so we started with our 303D program measures. So I think we're off to the races and successfully reporting on WQ27 and 28. And then, but next, and it's sort of actually on my plate to actually kick off the next round of discussions on the next suite of measures, which are those improving and restoring measures, restoring impaired waters, which sometimes are referred to right now as SP10 and SP11. So I will do a little plug that if anybody would like to be part of that work group, send me an email because I need to get that kicked off. We had some initial discussions on this topic back in 2014. Basically, we had a small work group made up of states and regions, and we were, again, kind of as the slide says, tasked with evaluating water quality improvement measures. Kind of how can we replace SP10 and SP11 to make them more meaningful using a data system to track, and then also how can we move to the use of catchments. And so we wanted to, looking at how do we make them, again, more transparent, easier to report, and better reflect what's happening on the ground. And then how do we kind of correlate them back with the 303D performance measures. I know when we had these discussions, everybody has also asked us to take on SP12, and then also make sure that we're coordinating with the non-point source program. So I'd have to say that we're pretty actively engaged with everybody to keep sure that we're on the same page, although I know that for various reasons the non-point source program is moving forward with some of their measure changes and so forth. But we are all talking to figure out how at the end of the day we can all be a little bit more succinct. So right now what's out there for purposes of improving the SP10 and 11 measure. It would actually be kind of replacing what's existing, are some proposed concepts. These are all draft. There's still a lot of discussion that has to happen, hence my plug for a work group. But right now, the proposed concepts are the extent of area within a state where all assessed causes of impairment and or designated uses are now meeting water quality standards. Extended area within a state where one or more of the assessed causes of impairment and or designated uses have activities that are being implemented and or are now meeting water quality standards. Here we want to be able to show that, again, similar to kind of the TMDL measure, having that incremental kind of feel to it, how can we show where states are implementing actions, be it BMPs or permits, short of, but the water's not meeting standards, how can we start showing that? And so as part of the Attains redesign, we're building in, kind of this actions piece so that we can start hopefully tracking that and showing where things are actually happening. And then we also tried to put there kind of a standalone protection measure. Similar to the other measures, using catchments to be able to communicate that, and this is just a conceptual display of what that would look like. So for me, I think kind of some big takeaways are, the Attains redesign is really instrumental in kind of calculating these new performance measures. I think right now it's a little bit piecemeal, but I think it's still working pretty well and more efficiently than what I actually had anticipated. So that's pretty exciting. I'm hoping that, a year from now, though, the system will be in place and it's going to be a lot more seamless on your end. Linking the performance measures and the integrated reporting data Attains hopefully is going to reduce the burden on all ends. I think moving to catchments, it's allowing for increased transparency. And then, as I mentioned, discussions are underway with improving the other measures as well as coordination with the 319 program. In the appendices, I do have a couple of slides. One is just on the measures, kind of just the standard definitions. There's also one slide on a lean event, and then just a kind of probably a little bit out of date, maybe schedule for the framework, the one that needs to be a little bit updated. But I'll just quickly touch a lean event. So about over a year ago, we had the opportunity to bring together a small group of states and regions and headquarters people to identify how can we improve the IR process. And I think what was pretty instrumental in, helping facilitate the Attains redesign discussions that Dwayne's been leading pretty significantly over the past year was that it really identified and showed that the data needs to be integrated with a process from the beginning. And so as you can see, the very top map really laid it all out. And if you got all the way down to the very end of the wall, the data piece came at the very end. And as many of you guys know, that's always the case when you get an email from Wendy and myself about 6 months after you've approved a list and given us the data. We're like, hello, it's time for you to review the data, when everybody's busy with a lot of other things. And so, I think with the new approach that we're implementing as part of the Attains redesign, by integrating the data at the upfront, I think we're going to see a lot of improvements and efficiencies as we move forward. So a lot of exciting things going on. So I think I'll end there with my part of the presentation, and then I don't know, Laura, see if I know Dwayne or Wendy or others, if there's anything to add or that I might have missed, or and then just open it up for questions.